The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I stood at the entrance of the Naval Officers Club ballroom. Not from nerves, I'd steadied my hands through Category 5 storms in submarine conning towers, but from the sheer effort of containing everything I'd become while playing the role they expected, Marcus's disappointing little sister. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, addressed in my brother's perfect Annapolis-trained handwriting. Captain Marcus Williams requests the honor of your presence at his promotion ceremony. I'd stared at it for a full minute, wondering if this was his way of extending an olive branch after years of careful exclusion from his military life. I should have known better. The ballroom sparkled with the kind of aggressive elegance that only military formal events can achieve. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing lights across rows of medals, making the room look like a constellation of achievements. Officers in dress whites moved through the space with practiced grace, their spouses in evening gowns that cost more than I'd spent on groceries in 6 months. Or so they assumed. The string quartet played Pachelbel's canon with mathematical precision, each note as perfectly placed as the creases in every uniform. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a simple navy dress that whispered rather than shouted, paired with my grandmother's pearl earrings. The only hint of my true life was the submarine warfare pin I wore as a brooch. Small enough to be overlooked, significant enough for those who knew. Most wouldn't recognize it. Most didn't know women could even earn dolphins. Taking a breath that went all the way down to my steel-toed boots, hidden beneath the dress hem, I moved through the crowd. Muscle memory from years of navigating tight submarine passages made me efficient at sliding between clusters of conversing officers. I caught fragments of discussion about deployment schedules, promotion boards, and the eternal Navy complaint about coffee quality aboard ships. Sarah Williams? I turned to find Commander Janet Brooks, one of Marcus's academy classmates. Her smile was bright but puzzled, as if she couldn't quite place me in this glittering context. Janet, I nodded, accepting her air kiss. Lovely ceremony. I didn't know you were, Marcus never mentioned you'd be attending. She glanced at my simple dress, her expression shifting to something between pity and relief. How nice that you could make it. Are you still doing, community college? Something like that, I replied, having learned long ago that correcting assumptions often caused more problems than letting them stand. She patted my arm with the kind of condescension reserved for poor relations at rich gatherings. Well, family is family. Marcus is so generous to include everyone. Generous. I thought of the last 12 family events I hadn't been invited to. The Academy ring ceremony where my parents were given only one guest ticket. The countless promotion parties I'd learned about through Facebook photos. Yes, Marcus had always been generous with his exclusions. I finally spotted him near the head table, resplendent in his dress whites, the fresh captain's insignia catching light like small suns. He stood at the center of a gravitational pull of admirers, fellow officers, political connections, the kinds of people who mattered in his meticulously curated world. His wife, Victoria, stood beside him in a crimson gown that managed to be both stunning and regulation appropriate, her smile as practiced as a drill maneuver. Our parents flanked them like proud bookends. Dad wore his ancient dress blues from his enlisted days, the fabric straining slightly at the seams. Mom clutched her purse with both hands, her department store dress making her look exactly what she was. working-class royalty in a palace that demanded pedigree. I waited for the crowd around Marcus to thin before approaching. My brother saw me coming. I caught the exact moment his expression shifted from political smile to something harder. He leaned over, whispered something to Victoria, who glanced my way with the kind of look reserved for checking if the catering staff had arrived. "Marcus," I said when I reached them, "congratulations on your promotion." He looked through me for a moment, as if trying to place a half-remembered acquaintance. "Sarah." Just my name, flat as a becalmed sea. Then louder, performing for his audience, "I didn't think you'd actually come." "I received an invitation," I said simply. "Yes, well." He gestured vaguely at the surrounding tables with their pristine place cards and centerpieces. "As you can see, we're a bit organized here. The family table is full." I followed his gesture to the table in question, where 3 empty chairs stood like accusations. Victoria touched his arm, a gesture that looked supportive but felt like a cue. Perhaps she could find a spot near the back. "I think the event staff have a section." By the kitchen, Marcus finished, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that comes from absolute social confidence. "There's standing room there, you understand, Sarah. These things have protocols." Seating arrangements were submitted weeks ago to command. Can't just shuffle things around. The conversation around us hadn't stopped, but it had quieted the way conversations do when people sense blood in the water. I felt the weight of eyes, the measurement happening behind polite smiles. Here was Marcus's odd sister, the one who'd dropped out to find herself, standing in her off-the-rack dress among people who bought their shoes in Italy. "Of course," I heard myself say, my voice steady as a periscope bearing. "I understand completely." Marcus had already turned back to his circle, dismissing me with the efficiency of someone used to giving orders. But then, as if remembering something amusing, he added over his shoulder, "Some of us earned our place at these tables, Sarah. The Navy isn't a charity, it's a meritocracy." The words landed like depth charges in the silence that followed. Someone actually gasped, probably one of the junior officers' wives, who still believed in things like family loyalty. I stood there for a moment that stretched like a mid-watch, feeling the full weight of my invisibility in his world. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that I'd been returning from a place they couldn't imagine when I'd received his invitation. A place where merit was measured in milliseconds and fathoms, where your last name meant nothing compared to your ability to keep 150 souls alive in a steel tube beneath Arctic ice. He didn't know about the dolphins I'd earned, the stars on my real uniform, or the letter of commendation that sat in my sea bag from an operation so classified I couldn't even tell myself about it in the mirror. I smiled, the kind of smile you learn when you're the only woman in a submarine wardroom, when you have to be twice as good to be seen as half as worthy. "You're absolutely right, Marcus. It is about merit." Then I walked toward the kitchen entrance, my grandmother's pearls catching the light with each step. Shame tastes like champagne, expensive, bitter, and impossible to swallow in public. But patience? Patience tastes like the sea itself, vast, deep, and hiding more than the surface ever shows. Standing by the kitchen entrance, watching servers balance trays of canapes I'd never learned to pronounce correctly, I let myself drift back to where it all began. Memory is a strange compass. It doesn't always point true north, but it always points to what shaped you. Growing up in the Williams household meant understanding hierarchies before you could spell the word. Marcus was 11 when I was born, already a small sun around which our family orbited. His school photos lined the hallway like Stations of the Cross, Science Fair winner, Eagle Scout, Naval Sea Cadet Commander. By the time I was old enough to understand what those frames meant, there was no wall space left for me. "Your brother's special," Mom would say, carefully ironing his NJROTC uniform while my school clothes waited in the dryer. "He's going places. We all have to make sacrifices for those who are destined for greatness." I learned early that sacrifice meant silence. When Marcus needed SAT tutoring, my piano lessons ended. Temporarily, they said, though temporary stretched into forever. When he got into the Naval Academy, our college fund became his celebration fund. I sat at his appointment ceremony, 16 years old, in a borrowed dress, watching congressmen shake his hand, while calculating how many night shifts at the grocery store would equal one semester at community college. "Sarah understands," Dad would tell relatives who asked about my plans. "She's practical. Not everyone's cut out for big dreams." The truth was more complex. I was practical because dreams were expensive, and in our house there was only budget for one dreamer. While Marcus attended academy balls, I attended night school. While he learned navigation by the stars, I learned to navigate FAFSA forms and work-study programs. But here's what they never knew. Water finds its own level, always. The day Marcus graduated from Annapolis, his dress whites immaculate, his bearing perfect, I sat in the audience between my parents, invisible in the sea of proud families. The speaker talked about service, sacrifice, and excellence, about how these new officers would lead from the front, never asking their sailors to do what they wouldn't do themselves. That night, while Marcus celebrated at the Officers' Club, I caught a Greyhound back to my job at the loading dock. My supervisor, an old Navy chief named Rodriguez, took one look at my face and said, "Rough day, kid." "My brother just commissioned," I told him, moving boxes with practiced efficiency. "He's going to be a surface warfare officer." Rodriguez snorted. "Surface? Targets, we called them in the submarine force. Easy to spot, easy to hit." He studied me for a moment. "You ever think about serving?" "Can't afford college," I said automatically. Who said anything about college first? He pulled a card from his wallet, a Navy recruiter's contact. "Submarine force needs smart people who can think in 3 dimensions and don't need their hands held. Nuclear program's got its own pipeline. You interested in real sailing, or you want to stay here feeling sorry for yourself?" That card burned in my pocket for 3 weeks. While Marcus posted photos from his first ship assignment, I stared at submarine documentaries on YouTube, learning about a different kind of Navy. The silent service, they called it, where nobody cared about your pedigree, only whether you could keep a nuclear reactor stable at test depth. I enlisted without telling anyone. The morning I left for boot camp, I wrote a note saying I'd found a job out of state. Let them think I was waiting tables or working retail. It was easier than explaining why Marcus's little sister thought she belonged in uniform too. Boot camp was nothing compared to nuclear power school. While Marcus sent home photos from port visits in the Mediterranean, I was buried in thermodynamics textbooks in Charleston, South Carolina. The math that had once seemed impossible became a language I spoke fluently. I wasn't just good, I was exceptional. But I kept that excellence quiet, the way I'd learned to keep everything quiet. My first deployment came while Marcus was earning his surface warfare pin. He posted proud photos on Facebook, our parents sharing them with comments about their Navy star. Meanwhile, I was qualifying as one of the first female submarine officers, earning my dolphins in silence beneath the Pacific. The funny thing about submarine service, it changes how you see everything. Surface ships announce themselves with radar signatures and wake patterns. Submarines exist in negative space, defined by what they don't reveal. I learned to be like that too, present but undetected, effective but unannounced. Years compressed like atmosphere at depth. While Marcus climbed the traditional ladder, Lieutenant JG to lieutenant, each promotion celebrated with family gatherings I wasn't invited to. I took a different path. The Seaman to Admiral program was mentioned to me by my commanding officer after I'd solved a reactor casualty that had stumped the entire engineering department. "Williams," he'd said, studying my service record, "you're wasted as an enlisted nuke. Ever think about commissioning?" "I don't have a degree, sir." "You've got something better, proven performance under pressure. There's a program, highly competitive. 1 in 1,000 make it through. But if anyone can." He'd left it hanging, an unfinished sentence I completed with years of brutal work. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Marcus networked at Naval Academy alumni events, I was earning my commission through the Navy's most demanding program. While he learned leadership in classrooms, I learned it in the engine room of a nuclear submarine, where mistakes weren't graded, they were catastrophic. Our parents never knew. How could I explain that their disappointing daughter, the one who'd dropped out and disappeared, was now Lieutenant Williams, serving in operations so classified that my own fitness reports were redacted? It was easier to let them keep their narrative. Marcus the golden child, Sarah the cautionary tale. The last family dinner I'd attended was 2 Thanksgivings ago. Marcus held court about his upcoming department head tour, while I helped Mom in the kitchen, my hands steady despite the burn scars from firefighting training. "At least Sarah knows her place," he'd joked to our cousins. "Someone has to keep the home fires burning while the real sailors are at sea." I'd smiled, thinking of the attack submarine I'd be boarding in 72 hours. The Arctic operations that would test every skill I'd earned in silence. His words didn't hurt anymore. They were just sound waves, and I'd learned to operate below the layer where surface noise mattered. Now, standing in this glittering ballroom, watching my brother bask in recognition he'd earned fair and square, I felt the weight of all those silent years. Not with bitterness, but with something closer to pity. He'd never know the satisfaction of earning something without connections, of being judged solely on performance, of existing in a meritocracy so pure it didn't care about your last name or your academy ring. The kitchen door swung open, releasing the scent of prime rib and possibility. A server smiled at me apologetically. "Ma'am, are you waiting for someone?" "No," I said, returning her smile. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." I collected their dismissals like coordinates, plotting a course they'd never see coming. Because the best navigation happens in the deep, where surface storms can't reach and only pressure makes diamonds. 2 years before Marcus's promotion ceremony, before I stood by his kitchen entrance like a ghost at my own family's feast, there was another dinner that changed everything. Sometimes a single moment cracks you open so completely that you have no choice but to let something new grow from the fracture. It was Thanksgiving, and I'd driven 14 hours straight from Kings Bay, Georgia, where my submarine was in refit. My command had given me exactly 96 hours of liberty, enough time to pretend I still belonged at the Williams family table. I'd even stopped at a bakery in Savannah to buy Mom's favorite pecan pie, the expensive kind with bourbon in the filling that she'd never buy for herself. The house smelled like my childhood: turkey and sage, cinnamon and cloves, all the traditional scents that were supposed to mean home. But home is a complicated coordinate when you've spent the last 3 years learning that family can be 150 sailors in a steel tube, trusting each other with their lives in the darkness beneath the ocean. I arrived to find the dining room already set for performance. Marcus held the head of the table, Dad's old spot, with Victoria beside him in a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly hazardous duty pay. Our cousins filled the sides, their children fidgeting in tiny pressed outfits. Mom bustled between kitchen and dining room, her apron hiding a dress I recognized from 5 Thanksgivings ago. "Sarah," she hugged me quickly, then held me at arm's length. "You look tired, honey. Are you eating enough? What kind of hours are they making you work at that? Where is it you said you worked?" "Just long shifts, Mom," I said, the lie comfortable as an old uniform. "Where would you like me to help?" "Oh, everything's almost ready. Marcus has been telling us about his selection for department head. Can you believe it? Our boy, running an entire department on a destroyer." She beamed toward the dining room. "Victoria says they might get stationed in Hawaii next. Imagine that." I could imagine it. I could also imagine the submarine operations in those same waters, the cat-and-mouse games we played with surface ships who never knew we were there. But I just smiled and tied on an apron, falling into the rhythm of kitchen work that had always been my assigned station at family gatherings. The conversation from the dining room drifted into the kitchen as I mashed potatoes with perhaps more force than necessary. Marcus was explaining the intricacies of surface warfare tactics to our uncle, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who enjoyed being the expert in the room. "The thing civilians don't understand," he said, "is that real naval power is about presence, showing the flag, being visible. That's why submarine service is really just support. Important, sure, but it's the surface fleet that does the real diplomatic work." I added butter to the potatoes, thinking of the intelligence operations I couldn't discuss, the prevention of conflicts that never made headlines because they never happened. Silence as strategy, absence as presence. "Sarah's here, by the way," Mom announced as she grabbed the cranberry sauce. "She drove all night from her job." "Still doing shift work?" Marcus called out, not bothering to come greet me. "You know, Sarah, it's never too late to go back to school. I could probably write you a recommendation for community college. Might help offset the gap in your resume." The cousins murmured sympathetically. "Poor Sarah," their tone said, still finding herself at 28. I carried dishes to the table, each trip requiring me to pass Marcus's chair. He never looked up, too busy regaling the table with stories of port visits and diplomatic receptions. Victoria occasionally touched his arm, a gesture that seemed less like affection and more like a conductor tapping a podium, cueing the next movement in his symphony of self-importance. Dinner progressed with the usual rhythms. Dad carved the turkey with ceremonial precision, while Marcus advised him on technique. The cousins shared updates about their children's achievements, soccer trophies, honor rolls, college acceptances, normal family pride normally expressed. When the conversation turned to careers, as it always did, Marcus launched into his favorite topic, military leadership. The academy really separates those who can lead from those who can't, he said, gesturing with his wine glass. It's not just about being smart, it's about breeding, really. 4 years of proper military education creates a different caliber of officer. What about enlisted soldiers? My cousin Emma asked. Don't some of them become officers? Marcus laughed, that particular laugh I'd heard throughout my childhood, the one that made questions sound quaint. Sure, Mustangs we call them. They try hard, but you can always tell. They lack refinement, the strategic vision. They're good at following orders, not giving them. I set down the gravy boat carefully, my hands steady, despite the anger carbonizing in my chest, like reactor fuel approaching critical mass. Although, Marcus continued, warming to his theme, at least enlisted folks serve, better than civilians who never contribute anything. Like Sarah here, still trying to find herself, while the rest of us actually serve our country. Marcus, Mom said softly, a gentle warning. What? I'm being supportive. Look, Sarah's helping in the kitchen. She finally found where she belongs. Not everyone needs to be exceptional. Society needs support roles too. He raised his glass in my direction. That same dismissive gesture I'd seen 1,000 times. To Sarah, keeping the home fires burning while real sailors do the work. The table laughed, uncomfortable laughter, but laughter nonetheless. Even Dad chuckled into his napkin. I stood there holding a dish of green beans I'd prepared, feeling the weight of every dismissal, every assumption, every time I'd chosen silence over conflict. The submarine warfare pin hidden in my pocket seemed to burn against my ribs. The dolphins I'd earned through months of qualification, studying systems until my eyes bled, proving myself to crews who didn't care about my gender or background, only competence. I set the green beans down with deliberate calm. Then I untied Mom's apron, folded it precisely, the way I'd learned to fold things in the Navy, where every inch of space mattered, and placed it on the counter. You're right, Marcus, I said, my voice carrying the kind of quiet that precedes depth charges. Not everyone needs to be exceptional by traditional standards. I walked to the dining room doorway, memorizing this moment. The table laden with abundance I'd never been invited to fully share. The faces that had decided my worth before I'd had a chance to prove it. The brother who'd built his identity partly on the foundation of my designated failure. I need to go, I said simply. Early shift tomorrow. But you just got here, Mom started. Let her go, Marcus waved dismissively. Some people can't handle family time. Too much success in one room, probably. Intimidating. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the last time as a supplicant at his table. Tomorrow I would submit my package for the Seaman to Admiral program. Tomorrow I would stop asking permission to exist in spaces I'd already earned. Tomorrow I would begin the transformation from family ghost to something they couldn't imagine. But tonight, I simply said, enjoy your dinner. You've all earned your places at this table. I left the pie on the kitchen counter and walked out into the November night. The air was crisp, full of stars, the same stars Marcus claimed to navigate by, never knowing I'd learned to sail without them. in places where starlight couldn't reach. Sitting in my car, I pulled out my phone and opened the email I'd been carrying for a week, the one encouraging me to apply for the commissioning program. My commanding officer had called it 1,000-to-1 shot, with the kind of smile that suggested he'd already bet on me. I typed 2 words, "I'm ready." Then I drove away from the warm lights of my childhood home toward a future they'd never see coming. Not because I hid it, but because they'd trained themselves not to look. I didn't need their table anymore. I was building my own fleet. And unlike surface ships that announce their presence with wake and radar, mine would rise from the deep when they least expected it, bearing flags they'd never imagined I could earn. The next 3 years unfolded like a classified operations manual, each page revealing capabilities no one suspected existed. After that Thanksgiving night, I eliminated all social media, changed my phone number, and gave my family a P.O. box in Atlanta with a vague explanation about corporate restructuring at my fictional job. They didn't question it. Sarah's disappointments had become background noise in the Williams family symphony, easy to tune out. What they didn't know could have filled the Library of Congress's classified vault. The Seaman to Admiral program was designed to find diamonds in the rough, enlisted sailors with exceptional potential who could be transformed into commissioned officers. The selection rate was 0.1%. The dropout rate for those selected was 60%. The nuclear pipeline component had its own hellish statistics that made grown men cry into their thermodynamics textbooks. I didn't cry, I calculated. While Marcus posted photos from port calls in Dubai and Singapore, Surface Navy's grand tradition of diplomatic visibility, I was learning to think in dimensions most people couldn't imagine. Nuclear Power School in Charleston was 12 hours a day of physics, chemistry, and reactor dynamics. My classmates were mostly fresh-faced 22-year-olds with engineering degrees. I was older, harder, and I'd already spent years proving myself in engine rooms where theory met reality at 400 feet below sea level. Williams, my nuclear theory instructor, said after I'd scored perfect marks on an exam that had devastated the rest of the class, "Where did you say you went to college?" "I didn't, sir," I replied, organizing my notes with submarine-bred precision. Everything I know I learned from Chief Rodriguez and a lot of late nights with library books. He stared at me like I'd just explained how to split atoms with a hammer and good intentions. But that was the truth. When you can't afford formal education, you become your own university. Every duty day in the engine room had been a classroom. Every qualified watchstander had been a professor. Every casualty drill had been a final exam, where failure meant more than a bad grade. I graduated at the top of my nuclear power class. The ceremony was small, private. The Navy doesn't advertise its nuclear operators to the world. No family in the audience, no photos for social media. Just a handshake from an admiral who said, "The fleet needs officers like you, Williams. Don't let us down." My first assignment as a commissioned officer was to USS Pennsylvania, a Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine. While Marcus was learning to coordinate helicopter operations on his destroyer's flight deck, I was learning to manage one of the most complex machines ever built by human hands. A submarine is a sovereignty, its own nation beneath the waves, carrying enough firepower to end civilizations, maintained by people who understood that excellence wasn't optional when failure meant death by implosion or radiation. The learning curve was vertical. Officer basic course taught theory, submarine life taught reality. I qualified as officer of the deck in record time, then as engineering officer of the watch. Each qualification was a marathon of studying systems, standing watches, and proving to skeptical, senior enlisted sailors that this former nuke machinist mate deserved their respect as an officer. "Ma'am," my chief of the boat said after I'd successfully managed a complex reactor startup, "I've seen Academy grads take twice as long to get that right. Where'd you really come from?" "The same place as you, Chief," I replied. "The fleet." He'd smiled then, the kind of smile senior enlisted reserve for officers who get it. "Good answer, ma'am, good answer." Command noticed. My fitness reports used words like exceptional, unprecedented, and destined for major command. I was selected for department head 2 years early, then executive officer of a fast attack submarine before my Academy contemporaries had finished their first shore tours. While Marcus struggled through a mediocre fitness report that blamed personality conflicts for his failure to screen for department head on the first look, I was driving submarines through classified operations that tested every skill I'd earned. Intelligence-gathering missions that required us to operate in waters where discovery meant international incidents. Engineering casualty drills that pushed both machine and crew to their limits. The kind of excellence that never made headlines because success meant nobody knew we'd been there. The promotion to captain came with a phone call I'll never forget. I was standing in my stateroom, having just returned from a month-long operation in contested waters, when the detailer called. "Commander Williams, congratulations, you've been selected for 06. More importantly, you've been slated for major command. You're getting your own boat." I sat down hard on my rack, the weight of it hitting me like test depth. My own submarine. Command at sea. The culmination of everything I'd worked toward in silence. "There's more," the detailer continued. "Given your record and the needs of the service, you're being considered for the flag officer pipeline. The board was impressed. Apparently, you solved a reactor problem last year that saved the Navy about $40 million in repairs. It was just applied thermodynamics, sir," I said, thinking of those late nights in nuclear power school, the equations I'd memorized because I couldn't afford to fail. "Just applied thermodynamics," he repeated with a laugh. "Williams, do you understand what you've achieved? You're on track to become one of the youngest admirals in naval history, and the first woman to rise from enlisted nuclear machinist mate to flag rank. The first, the youngest." Superlatives that would have meant everything to Marcus, but to me meant only that I'd have to work harder to prove I deserved them. Taking command of USS Seawolf was like being handed the keys to a Formula One race car designed by someone who thought physics was more of a suggestion than a law. The fast attack submarine community is small, elite, and unforgiving of anything less than perfection. My crew watched me with the kind of attention submariners reserve for new captains, waiting to see if I'd earn their trust or just their compliance. I earned it the way I'd earned everything else, by being better, by knowing every system better than my engineers, by making tactical decisions that kept us undetected in waters where detection meant failure, by never asking my crew to do anything I wouldn't do myself, including hot racking in enlisted berthing when maintenance schedules demanded all-hands evolution. The Meritorious Service Medal came after an operation I still can't discuss. The Legion of Merit followed a deployment where we'd prevented something that never made the news because prevention doesn't headline well. Each ribbon on my uniform represented months of silence, excellence without recognition, the kind of service that happens in negative space. Meanwhile, Marcus finally made 05, posting proudly about his promotion ceremony on Facebook. Our parents stood beside him in the photos, Mom wiping tears of pride while Dad saluted his son's achievement. The comments were full of congratulations, family friends praising the Williams family's naval tradition. If they only knew that their disappointing daughter had just been selected for Rear Admiral, lower half, that the kid who'd dropped out was about to pin on stars, that every dismissal, every joke about knowing my place, had been fuel for a reactor that ran on pure determination. But I maintained silence like a submarine maintains depth, carefully, purposefully, and with full knowledge that surfacing too early ruins the entire operation. My promotion ceremony was scheduled for 6 months out. Until then, I had a submarine to command, missions to complete, and a reputation to build that had nothing to do with my last name. The invitation to Marcus's captain's ceremony arrived while I was at sea, running drills in preparation for an overseas deployment. My executive officer brought it to me with raised eyebrows. "Family event, Captain." I looked at the elegant cardstock, the same perfect handwriting, the assumption that I'd attend as the same disappointment I'd always been in their eyes. "Yes," I said, folding it carefully. "Family." Success is loudest when it makes no sound at all. Like sonar pings in the deep, the silence between them tells you more than the noise ever could. The kitchen entrance of the Naval Officers Club gave me a perfect vantage point. Like a periscope at depth, I could observe without being observed, tracking the ceremony's progression through the swinging doors. The wait staff moved around me with professional invisibility, assuming I was either lost or exactly where I belonged, both true in their own way. Marcus's promotion ceremony was reaching its crescendo. The commanding officer of his destroyer squadron had just finished a speech about leadership, dedication, and the sacred trust of command. I'd heard variations of it throughout my career, though usually from the other side of the podium. Captain Marcus Williams represents the finest traditions of surface warfare, the Commodore intoned. His pedigree, from his academy education to his progression through the ranks, exemplifies what we seek in our leaders. Pedigree. I smiled at that, thinking of my own mongrel path. Enlisted to officer, submarine qualification, earned in engine rooms that smelled of ammon and dedication. Stars earned in spaces where nobody cared about your bloodline, only your competence. Through the kitchen window, I watched my parents. Dad sat straighter than his arthritis usually allowed, pride radiating from every line of his weathered face. Mom dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief I recognized from my childhood, the one with embroidered anchors she'd bought at the Navy Exchange 30 years ago when Dad was still active duty. They deserved this moment. Whatever complicated feelings I harbored about Marcus, our parents had sacrificed everything for his dream. Let them have their glory. My own promotion ceremony was scheduled for next month in Pearl Harbor, a quiet affair with just my crew and the submarine force leadership. They'd never know, and perhaps that was kinder. I was preparing to slip out the service exit, my presence acknowledged, my duty done, when the entire energy of the room shifted. The main doors opened with authority, not ceremony. The Chief of Naval Operations entered flanked by his security detail, their presence immediately commanding attention. CNO Admiral Jonathan Rackham was not on the guest list. I'd seen it posted by the entrance. His appearance at a simple O5 promotion ceremony was like finding a battleship in a bathtub. The room snapped to attention with the physical comedy of civilians, trying to remember military courtesy while juggling champagne flutes. Officers straightened like compass needles finding north. The string quartet stuttered to silence mid-Beethoven. "As you were," Admiral Rackham said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 40 years of making decisions that mattered. "Please continue. I apologize for the interruption." But he was scanning the room, those sharp eyes that had tracked Soviet submarines during the Cold War now hunting for something or someone else. "I heard through the grapevine that Admiral Williams might be attending her brother's promotion," he said conversationally, though his voice carried to every corner of the ballroom. "Given that she's deploying next week for Indopacom operations, I thought I'd take the opportunity to—" He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze finding me by the kitchen entrance. A smile broke across his weathered face, the kind of smile admirals reserve for problems that solve themselves. "Admiral Williams," he called out, "I didn't expect to find you observing from the galley." Every head in the room turned in synchronized confusion. Admiral Williams? The only Williams they knew was Marcus, and he was standing frozen at the podium, his new captain's eagles suddenly looking very small. I had two choices: maintain the fiction or surface like the submarine officer I was, at the optimal moment for maximum effect. I stepped away from the kitchen entrance, and as I did, I let my shoulders find their true bearing. Not the practiced slouch of someone trying to disappear, but the posture of someone who'd stood officer of the deck watches in State 5 Seas, who'd made decisions affecting national security, who'd earned every gold star on the uniform hidden beneath my coat. "Admiral Rackham," I replied, my voice carrying across the ballroom with the same clarity I used to announce commanding officer arriving on the 1MC. I didn't want to disrupt my brother's ceremony. The silence that followed could have pressurized a submarine hull. I walked through the crowd that parted like the Red Sea, biblical, inevitable, impossible. My heels clicked against the floor with metronomic precision, each step a countdown to revelation. As I reached the center of the room, I unbuttoned my coat with deliberate calm. Beneath was my dinner dress blue uniform, the one I'd kept in my car just in case. 4 stars gleamed on my shoulder boards, not the single silver bar of an ensign or the oak leaves of a commander, but the constellation of a rear admiral. The first sound was a champagne flute hitting the floor, then another, then the sharp intake of breath from Victoria, who understood military ranks well enough to know she was looking at impossibility incarnate. "Admiral Williams," CNO Rackham continued, either oblivious to or enjoying the theater of the moment. "I was hoping to discuss the Pacific Submarine Readiness Report before your deployment. I know your boat just broke records on the ORS, but I'd like your assessment of the force-wide implications." He was giving me a gift, not just recognition, but context. Operational reactor safeguards examination, breaking records, force-wide implications. Each phrase a brushstroke, painting the picture of who I really was. Marcus's face went through a spectrum of expressions I'd only seen before in submarine emergency lighting, green to red to something beyond classification. His hand moved automatically to salute, muscle memory overriding cognitive dissonance. A captain must salute an admiral even when, especially when, that admiral is the sister you'd relegated to kitchen duty. I returned his salute with textbook precision, holding it a microsecond longer than required. Not cruelty, just acknowledgement of what we both knew. Rank has its privileges and its revelations. "Sir," I addressed Admiral Rackham, though my eyes never left Marcus. "Perhaps we could discuss the readiness report after the ceremony. I wouldn't want to overshadow my brother's moment." The CNO chuckled, a sound that probably hadn't been heard since his submarine days. Considerate as always, though I should mention, the Secretary of the Navy asked me to pass along his personal congratulations on your selection for the Nuclear Enterprise Leadership Award. Apparently, your innovations in reactor operations training have revolutionized how we qualify engineers. Each word landed like a Mark 48 torpedo. Nuclear Enterprise Leadership Award, Revolutionary Innovations. My parents sat frozen, Dad's salute hand trembling halfway to his forehead, Mom's handkerchief pressed to her mouth as if to hold in decades of assumptions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Rackham announced to the room with the casual authority of someone who'd never met, a silence he couldn't command. "You're in the presence of Admiral Sarah Williams, commanding officer of USS Seawolf, youngest woman ever to achieve flag rank in the submarine force, and next year's likely recipient of the Vice Admiral Stockdale Award for Inspirational Leadership." He turned to Marcus, whose salute was still frozen in place, like a museum exhibit on cognitive dissonance. "Your sister, Captain Williams, is what we call a fast burner in the submarine force," though I suspect his eyes twinkled with submarine humor. "She's been operating at depth for so long you never saw her periscope." The metaphor wasn't subtle, but then surface warfare officers rarely appreciated subtlety. They preferred their warfare visible, their achievements announced, their horizons uncluttered by the possibility that excellence could exist in the spaces they'd never thought to look. I stood there in the center of my brother's promotion ceremony, wearing stars he'd never dreamed I could earn, holding a silence that said more than any speech about merit, family, and the price of being invisible in your own history. Rank has a way of reorganizing every table in the room, and sometimes the best seat is the one you never needed to take. The ballroom held its breath like a submarine on silent running. Marcus's salute remained frozen in place, a statue dedicated to the moment reality reorganizes itself. I let him hold it for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to feel the weight of protocol, not long enough to be cruel. When I returned it with crisp precision, the sound of our hands dropping seemed to echo off the crystal chandeliers. "At ease, Captain," I said quietly, though the words carried to every corner of the room. The CNO excused himself to speak with the Commodore, leaving me standing face to face with my brother for the first time in 2 years. Up close, I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. How had he missed this? What did this mean? Where did this leave him in the order of things he'd thought immutable? "Sarah," he managed, his voice hoarse. When did you—" "Join the Navy," I supplied gently. 13 years ago. The nuclear program had different entrance requirements than the academy. Turns out they cared more about capability than credentials. Victoria appeared at his elbow, her red dress suddenly seeming less commanding next to my dinner blues. She looked between us with the expression of someone discovering their navigation charts had been upside down the entire voyage. "Admiral," she said, testing the word like a foreign language. "We had no idea. Marcus never mentioned." "He didn't know," I said simply. "It never came up at family dinners. Hard to work submarine operations into conversations about his surface deployments." My parents had made their way through the crowd, Dad limping slightly, but moving with purpose. Mom clutched his arm with both hands, her face a masterwork of conflicting emotions, pride, confusion, something that might have been grief for all the years of misunderstanding. "Sarah?" Mom's voice was small, uncertain. "Is this real? Are you really—" "Rear Admiral, lower half," I confirmed, keeping my tone neutral, informative. "Submarine Force, I command USS Seawolf out of Bangor." Dad's hand shook as he raised it in an automatic salute. I caught it gently, lowering it with the kind of care I'd learned for handling unstable ordnance. "Not necessary, Dad, not from family." "All these years," he said wonderingly. "You let us think. We said things. Marcus said things." I glanced at Marcus, who looked like he was experiencing his own internal reactor scram. People say what they need to say based on the information they have. I chose to keep my information compartmentalized. That's on me. It wasn't entirely, but grace costs nothing and pays dividends that compound over time. "Your security detail is outside, Admiral," a voice said behind me. My aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Commander Chen, had appeared with perfect timing, a skill I'd value in my next fitness report. "The vehicle is ready whenever you are." Security detail, official vehicle, the small details that painted a picture of a life they'd never imagined for the daughter who'd supposedly dropped out to find herself. Marcus finally found his voice, and it carried the tone of someone grasping for familiar ground. "Why didn't you tell us? I could have helped. Introduced you to people, helped your career." The irony was so perfect, it could have been weaponized. I smiled, not the sharp smile of victory, but the softer one of understanding. "Marcus," I said, adjusting my cover with practiced ease. I needed to know I could do it without introductions, without the Williams name opening doors, without anyone's help. I paused, letting the words find their depth. The submarine force was perfect for that. We operate independently by design. But family should— Victoria started. "Should what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Should know everything? Should have access to all compartments? Some of us serve better in silence. It's not personal, it's just operational." My aide cleared his throat discreetly. Submarine officers excel at nonverbal communication. Time to go. I had a briefing at Euro 600, a submarine to prepare for deployment, and a Pacific theater that wouldn't wait for family reconciliations. "I need to go," I said, the same words I'd used that Thanksgiving night, but with entirely different weight. "Congratulations again on your promotion, Marcus. Captain is a significant achievement. The surface force is lucky to have you." I meant it. Whatever our complications, he'd earned his rank through his own service. That it had come easier for him, supported by family resources and connections, didn't diminish the accomplishment. We'd simply taken different paths through different oceans. As I turned to leave, Marcus stepped forward. "Sarah, wait, there are things I should say, things I need to say." I paused, looking back at him with the patience I'd learned standing watch at test depth. calm, steady, aware that pressure must be managed carefully. "No," I said simply, "you don't. What you said before about earning our places, about merit, about some of us being made for different things, you weren't wrong. We did earn our places. They're just different places than either of us expected." The crowd parted again as I moved toward the exit, but this time the space felt different. Not the dismissive gap afforded to the unwanted, but the respectful distance given to rank and achievement. My parents stood frozen, still processing. Our cousins whispered behind raised hands. The junior officers looked at me with the expression of those recalculating their assumptions about what was possible. At the doorway, I stopped one final time. The same spot where I'd entered as an obligation, an embarrassment to be managed. Marcus remained in the center of the room, his promotion ceremony thoroughly eclipsed, surrounded by people who would never look at him quite the same way again. "Marcus," I called back, my voice carrying with the same authority I used to order dive operations. "You were right about one more thing. The Navy isn't a charity, it's a meritocracy." I smiled then, the smile of someone who'd found peace in the deep waters beyond family turbulence. "Thank you for teaching me that." Then I walked through those doors, my aide falling into step beside me, my security detail materializing from their invisible positions. The night air was crisp, full of stars I'd learned to navigate without, carrying the salt promise of oceans that didn't care about your last name. Behind me, I left a ballroom full of questions. A brother surrounded by his achievements that suddenly seemed smaller, and parents wondering how they'd missed an entire constellation while focusing on a single star. My driver held the door of the official vehicle. As I settled into the leather seats, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window, 4 stars catching the light like distant suns. Not the reflection of the disappointment they'd expected, but not revenge either. Just truth, delivered at the perfect depth, with perfect timing. Lieutenant Commander Chen sat across from me, already pulling up the briefing materials for tomorrow. "Successful evening, Admiral?" I considered the question as we pulled away from the officers' club, leaving the warm lights of Marcus's moment behind. Educational, I decided, for everyone involved. I gave him the respect his rank deserved, nothing more, nothing less, and that was everything. Because dignity isn't about what they took from you. It's about what you chose to keep. Part 7. The Echo. What the tide takes, it sometimes returns transformed. 6 months later, I stood on the bridge of USS Seawolf at sunset, 400 miles northwest of Guam. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, its surface deceptively calm, while currents below moved with purposes invisible to those who only sailed its face. My executive officer had just handed me the evening message traffic, but it was the personal letter, forwarded through official channels, that held my attention. Marcus's handwriting hadn't improved with his new responsibilities. If anything, it showed the tremor of someone writing truths they'd never expected to articulate. "Sarah, I'm writing this from the bridge of USS Fitzgerald. Funny how different the ocean looks when you know someone you love is beneath it. I find myself wondering during night watches if you're down there somewhere. If you're watching us the way we never watched you. They assigned me to your fleet. Desrun 15, under 7th Fleet. The irony isn't lost on me, the surface warrior now serving under the submarine admiral's larger command. The universe, as you once said about something else entirely, has a sense of humor. I've been thinking about tables lately, about who sits where and why, about the assumptions we make, based on visible seats while missing the ones that matter. You were never missing from our family table, Sarah. We just couldn't see you because we were looking at the wrong ocean. Mom keeps your picture on the mantle now, the one from your promotion ceremony that made the Navy Times. Dad reads everything he can find about submarine operations. Did you know he started a scrapbook? 30 years of my surface photos, and now he's cutting out articles about submarine achievements he doesn't fully understand, but knows involve you. I learned something during my first fleet exercise under your command. We were hunting a submarine, one of yours, probably, though the exercise controllers never confirm. 3 days of active searching with our best sonar operators. Nothing. Then, during the debrief, the controller showed us the submarine's track. It had been with us the entire time, sometimes close enough to read our hull numbers. We never knew. That's when I understood. You weren't hiding from us all those years. You were just operating at a depth we didn't know existed. My therapist, yes, I have one now, Victoria insisted, after what she calls the revelation, says I need to sit with the discomfort of having been wrong. Not just about you, but about what strength looks like. I used to think it was brass bands and port calls, dress whites and diplomatic receptions, visibility as valor. Now I know strength can be silent. Excellence can exist without witnesses. That maybe the greatest achievements are the ones that prevent disasters no one ever knows were possible. I've started reading about nuclear power, trying to understand what you mastered while I was learning celestial navigation. The math makes my head hurt. How did you do it, Sarah? How did you take our dismissal and transform it into fuel for that kind of excellence? Don't answer that. I know the answer. You did it the same way you do everything, quietly, completely, and without needing anyone's permission or approval. They tell me you're returning to Pearl next month. I'll be there for workups. Perhaps we could have dinner, not as captain and admiral, not as the golden child and the disappointment, just as siblings who took different paths through the same ocean. I'm not asking for forgiveness. You were right. Some things don't need to be said. But I wanted you to know that I see you now. Not just your rank or your achievements, but you. The sister who counted pennies while I counted medals, who found her own stars while I was busy polishing mine. Fair winds and following seas, Admiral. Your brother, Marcus. I folded the letter carefully, adding it to the small collection of personal items in my stateroom safe. Outside, the sun was setting in a blaze of color that would have made recruitment posters jealous. My officer of the deck announced the evening's position report with crisp efficiency. Admiral, he added after the formal report, sonar holds contact on a surface vessel bearing 270, range 12,000 yards, Fitzgerald-class destroyer based on the acoustic signature. I smiled. Classification? Friendly, ma'am, one of ours. One of ours. The possessive pronoun that encompassed so much, surface and submarine, visible and hidden, the brass bands and the silent service. All part of the same Navy, the same ocean, the same mission to sail dangerous waters and keep them safe. Maintain track, I ordered, but no need to announce our presence. I, Admiral, maintain track, remain undetected. I stayed on the bridge as darkness fell, thinking about Marcus's letter, about tables and belonging, about the long journey from that kitchen entrance to this command. Below us, my crew maintained their watch, nuclear reactors humming with controlled power, sonar operators tracking contacts they'd never meet, excellence operating in spaces most people would never know existed. The thing about operating at depth is that it changes your perspective on storms. Surface vessels fight waves, ride them out, announce their struggles with distress calls and weather reports. Submarines simply go deeper, finding the calm water that always exists below turbulence, not avoiding the storm, just choosing a different relationship with it. My parents had sent their own letters, full of apologies I didn't need, and pride that came too late to matter the way they thought it should. But I kept those letters too, because understanding is a gift, regardless of its timing. They couldn't have seen what they weren't equipped to look for. Submarine officers spend years learning to see what isn't there, to understand negative space as intelligence. I couldn't fault them for lacking training they'd never received. The stars were coming out now, the same stars Marcus used for navigation, that our father had taught him to read while I was learning different lessons in darker spaces. But stars are just fusion reactors at distance, and I'd learned to harness that power up close, contained and controlled, turning physics into forward motion. Admiral, my messenger appeared with the evening's intelligence brief. Captain reads compliments, and she requests your presence in the wardroom for planning. Very well, I'll be there in 5. I took one last look at the horizon, where I knew Marcus's destroyer sailed, visible to anyone who cared to look, proud and necessary in its visibility. Then I went below, leaving the stars to those who needed them, returning to the spaces where excellence didn't require light to exist. The last paragraph of Marcus's letter stayed with me as I descended the ladder. I used to think disappointment was about falling short of expectations. Now I realize the real disappointment was in expectations themselves, in thinking we knew what success looked like, in measuring depth by surface displacement. He was learning, we all were. Every tide takes something away. Innocence, assumptions, the comfortable fiction of fixed hierarchies. But tides return too, carrying back what they've taken, transformed by pressures we never see, into shapes we never expected. I'd started this journey as the daughter who didn't belong at the family table. I'd ended it with my own fleet, my own table, my own definition of belonging. Not revenge. That required anger I'd released at test depth years ago. Just the simple truth that excellence finds its own level, regardless of who's watching. The ocean doesn't care about your pedigree. It only asks if you can navigate its depths. And I could. Dignity isn't what they give you. It's what remains after they've tried to take everything. It's the ballast that keeps you stable in rough seas. The reactor that powers you through dark water, the chart that guides you home to yourself. Did this story of refined revenge touch your soul? At Refined Revenge, we believe the best revenge isn't served cold. It's served with class, dignity, and a success that speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. Subscribe now for more stories of elegant vindication, where underdogs rise not through petty retaliation, but through becoming everything their doubters said they couldn't be. Where silence becomes strength, dismissal becomes determination, and the sweetest victory is the one they never see coming. Every week, we bring you real stories of the overlooked who became unforgettable, the dismissed who became indispensable, the underestimated who rose to heights their critics couldn't imagine. Remember, the best revenge is a life well lived, a success well earned, and a dignity that no one can take away. Hit the notification bell to join our community of refined souls who know that true power doesn't need to announce itself. It simply rises, like cream, like truth, like submarines from the deep. Because sometimes the most powerful response to "you don't belong here" is to build a place where you don't need their permission to exist.